As of today, MSTR has just opened the door to potentially billions of dollars of capital inflows. Here we'll look at what that means for the stock and their Bitcoin accumulation. So let's get right into it. Here we're on the Treasury Company analytics page on BitcoinMagazinePro.com, where we can see all the data necessary to truly understand and analyze strategy, or formerly MicroStrategy. So we can scroll down here to see the underlying price of the stock, as well as that the performance since adoption, some key metrics, as well as their Bitcoin holdings over time. But if we just scroll down here, what we can see is here, the strategy real-time Treasury profit and loss currently sits at around $22 billion, which is absolutely unbelievable. And this massive earnings in Bitcoin is actually one of the key reasons why we may be about to see some massive inflows into the strategy stock. If we go to this article from the block here, it outlines it pretty nicely, but due to some recent FASB accountancy changes, which to be honest is a very boring topic of conversation for me personally, so having just quickly scanned through this, I can't say I'm an expert on the topic, but essentially MicroStrategy or strategy can now essentially report the Bitcoin profits or losses as earnings on their balance sheet. Now what we can see, if we just scroll down here, as MicroStrategy own around 600,000 Bitcoin worth tens of billions of dollars, around 2.84% of all Bitcoin that will ever exist, this is actually turning out to be a fairly profitable venture, especially over the most recent quarter. We can see strategy have been very aggressively accumulating pretty much throughout all of 2025. But what we can see is as the Bitcoin price, as I film this, is around $106,000, $107,000, this has actually reached a point in which strategy can now classify their Bitcoin holdings as sufficient earning potential to actually be considered for inclusion in the S&P 500. So that might sound a little bit confusing, but what we can do is just look at some comparisons for other similar stocks and how they reacted once they were actually chosen to be included in the S&P 500. So first and foremost, we'll have Tesla, which I know isn't exactly like strategy, but we can see on the 16th of November 2020, after hours, is when they were announced that they would be included in the S&P 500. And as well as that, most recently Coinbase, which again is a very good indication that strategy probably isn't too far away from being included in the S&P 500, considering we already have a crypto related business included in the index. And what we can see is this was on the 12th of May this year, so very recently, only just a few weeks ago. Now what we can do is if we just go over to TradingView here, what we can see if I go to this chart, here we have the Tesla stock price on the left here, and on the right hand side here we have Coinbase. So what I can do is just show these different percentage gains following these announcements. So we can see here from the 16th of May after hours, the Tesla closing price was down here around $136. And what we can see 70 days after this, the price had jumped 120%. And if we just zoom out, what we can see is if we just scroll across even further and extend this even further, so it's just under a year, 353 days later, this was over 204% gains in the Tesla share price, which is absolutely unbelievable in such a short space of time, especially considering how big their market capitalization was at that period of time as well. What we can see as well is if we zoom in here onto the Coinbase stock, we can see very recently after hours on the 12th of May, the Coinbase stock price was around $207, and it recently reached a peak of well over $370, around $375, which again is about an 82% increase in just 45 days of price action. Now we go over to the MicroStrategy share price here. We can see recently we have had a little bump up in the price action. Maybe people have realized that what this could actually mean for the MSTR share price, the potential inflows we're about to see due to this inclusion into the S&P 500 or potential inclusion. What we can do is if we just grab the same tool and anticipate some similar movements to what we saw in Coinbase or Tesla, we can see 45 days later, let's first track the Coinbase movement. So 45 days later at about 80%, we can see this would take us to new all-time highs easily. And if I just extend that up to around here, somewhere around there roughly, this would give an MSTR stock price of around $740, within mid-August, which would be absolutely crazy. But again, something not too dissimilar to what we've seen before. If we just look previously, we can see MSTR is very much used to making big moves like this. If I just grab the previous set of price action we saw throughout 2024 and overlay that onto the current price action, we could see if we were to replicate something similar to that, then that would actually make these returns look fairly puny in comparison. But if we were to assume we do something like the Tesla stock, where we go over 200% just a year following this, I can just extend this along here. And what we can see is, of course, this is going to be very much influenced by the underlying price action of Bitcoin. What we can see is if we would see a 200% increase in the MSTR share price after around a year, well, then we'd see the MSTR share price of around $1,250 at sometime in June or July of 2026, which would be pretty unbelievable, to be honest. But if we just go back here, what we can see is if we just look at the S&P 500 weightings, what we can actually try and gauge is how much inflows we're likely to see immediately following this hopeful announcement in the not too distant future. So first and foremost, if we look at Coinbase, we can see that they currently make up about 0.16% of the S&P 500, their total weightings. Now, what is interesting, if we just go back to TradingView here, and what we can do is open up this screener, what we can see is if we just look for Coinbase here, if we just scroll down and we see the market capitalization of Coinbase, it's at about $89.27 billion. Now, I know it's a little bit more complicated in terms of how they actually come up with these weightings, but if we just go to the NASDAQ and find MSTR, if we just scroll down here, we have a market capitalization of $110 billion. So MSTR might even get a bigger weighting than Coinbase once it is first introduced into the index, at potentially around 0.2%. Now, of course, as I said, we don't know exactly. It's all just speculation up until this point, but this could potentially lead to billions of dollars of inflows. If we just look to the SPY, the SPDR S&P 500 ETF Trust, what we can see is just looking at the flows and assets under management, the 1 month change of this is just one ETF, one S&P 500 tracker. The assets under management change during 1 month is $32 billion. If you imagine this over the course of a year, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. And even if we're 0.2% of that, that is a monumental amount of capital flowing into MSTR, which of course will then probably lead to subsequent Bitcoin accumulation, even more potential derivative products. And from there, we could see this price skyrocket even further. Now, one thing we need to acknowledge is recently MSTR has, I won't say underperformed, but if we just go back to the Treasury Analytics page here, what we can see is the premium to Bitcoin net asset value ratio has actually been declining. So while we have seen the share price steadily climbing up, maybe not outpacing Bitcoin as much as we'd really like to have seen recently, we can see that the premium, which is what a lot of investors are really focusing on, has actually been in a general downtrend. Now, what this is showing us is the total value of their Bitcoin holdings and that total value on the balance sheet compared to the underlying value of the company. So what we can see is right now it's somewhere around a value of 1.67, 1.5, 1.6, around that value, which shows us that the total value of the company, just based on their Bitcoin holdings, is about 1.5 times, not necessarily higher than it should be, because this is all based on the potential for further Bitcoin accumulation and Bitcoin price appreciation. But as I said, we can see this has been in a somewhat steady downtrend. Now, this is potentially due to the fact that we've seen lots of Bitcoin treasury companies, again, coming in, maybe not compete with MSTR, but definitely taking a little bit of the spotlight away from them, especially companies like Metaplanet, who have been accumulating like crazy recently, and of course 21, which have been buying tens of thousands of Bitcoin. Potentially the edge in MSTR has slightly been reduced recently. But now with this inclusion into the S&P 500, I know we currently have Coinbase in there, but this is a company that's mainly focusing, or not mainly focusing, but also focusing on alternate cryptocurrencies such as Ethereum and other smaller market capitalization coins. MSTR is going to be the first true Bitcoin treasury company included into the S&P 500. And once we start seeing billions of dollars flowing into that, again, allowing more and more capital to flow into their Bitcoin treasury, then this is ultimately and hopefully likely going to see this net asset value premium hopefully begin to increase once again. Now, what we can do with this information is if we just go over here, what we can see is how this might impact the underlying share price of MSTR. So what I'll do is I'll just move myself over here so it's a little bit easier to see. What we can see is the holdings to net asset value ratios up here, anywhere from 1 to 4, and the target price of Bitcoin. So we can see right now, as I said, the premium is about 1.6-ish, and the Bitcoin price is around $106,000. We can see we're pretty much right around here as MSTR are holding just under 600,000 Bitcoin. So this is pretty much bang on. What we can do is, assuming again, a continued rate of accumulation. If we just go quickly back to here, what we can see is since the start of 2025, if I go here, MSTR have held or accumulated probably around an additional 150,000 Bitcoin. We can see on January the 1st, they had 446,400, and today they're sitting on over 597,000. So pretty much bang on 150,000 Bitcoin accumulated in the first half of 2025. If we assume a consistent rate of adoption and accumulation for Bitcoin, then we may see their holdings of somewhere around 750,000 Bitcoin before the end of 2025. So we just hover somewhere around 700 to 800,000, give them a little bit of leeway to the upside or the downside. And again, assume a net asset value premium, if we just go back to this chart here, of slightly higher than what we've currently seen. We can see we've seen highs as high as 3 or 2.89 just a few months ago. But even in the prior cycle, we saw the values of this considerably above 3. But if we just assume a net asset value premium somewhere around 2 to 2.5, if we just go back here, and a Bitcoin holdings of somewhere around 700 to 800,000, then we could see a MSTR price of somewhere between $630 and $900. But that is solely based on Bitcoin being valued at 100K. What we can do is if we just look at something like this, which is tracking the realized price or the average accumulation price of Bitcoin, and then comparing that to the underlying price of Bitcoin to get this market value to realized value score or Z score, what we can see is how much upside potential Bitcoin really has remaining for this cycle. We can see we currently sit with a value of around 2.43, and typically bull cycle peaks occur above values of 7 in this metric. So we definitely have the potential for Bitcoin to rally substantially higher throughout the remainder of this cycle, especially when you consider how much liquidity is being injected into the system, the more risk-on sentiment that we're seeing across markets now that there's a little bit less uncertainty and geopolitical tension. Now, while we may not see values as high as we have done in previous cycles, there is undoubtedly upside potential remaining for this Bitcoin cycle. So if we just go back here and we were to anticipate a Bitcoin price of say $150,000, and again, somewhere between a premium of 2 to 2.5, 700 to 800,000 dollars, 700 to 800,000 Bitcoin in their treasury, then suddenly we see a fair value of MSTR of somewhere between $950 to $1,350, which would just be absolutely crazy considering the stock price is somewhere around $400 right now. That asymmetric opportunity is absolutely unbelievable. And again, this is $150,000, which some people may see as a more conservative estimate. If we go to $200,000, for example, which would be somewhere around the upper bounds of my estimate for where Bitcoin could reach this cycle, again, suddenly we're seeing MSTR stock valuations of between $1,250 and just above $1,800. Now, if we were to reach $250,000, which is my very upper target of Bitcoin's potential this cycle, then still we're seeing Bitcoin or MSTR price targets of around $1,580 to $2,250. Around $2,000 as a potential price target for MSTR, as we're currently at around $400. That's a potential 5x, as Bitcoin may only do about a 2.5x. One thing we can also look at is if we go to the Bitcoin versus MSTR chart here, so many people actually track the Bitcoin price in US dollar terms, same as MicroStrategy. What we can actually do is almost get a ratio between these. So what we can see here is this is the Bitcoin price action, but since MSTR have actually begun accumulating Bitcoin in August of 2020, we can see that while this very much looks like a standard Bitcoin price action chart, from August 2020, we've actually seen this in a little bit of a downtrend. Even though Bitcoin is close to all-time highs as I film this, we've actually seen this continue to make lower lows. If I actually just draw on a box around here to outline the probable point of support and resistance and the point of support and resistance that we're currently within, we can see that Bitcoin versus MSTR is currently at a very crucial point. We can see we're currently at levels similar to our 2018 bear cycle lows. Now, what this is actually showing us is if we look onto the right-hand side here, is whereas if you track Bitcoin versus the US dollar, you can essentially look at it as one Bitcoin will get you $106,000, $107,000. Whereas when we look at BTC USD versus MSTR, we can essentially see that one Bitcoin would currently get you around 260 shares in MSTR. But we can see we're currently at a very critical point here, and support and technical analysis, on these charts still works incredibly effectively. If we were to see a breakdown on this major key support level on this chart and come back up, potentially retest it and break lower, then that'd give us some indication that we're about to see a huge period of outperformance for MSTR. Now, if we just zoom out, we can actually gain a potential target point for where we could end up in the coming months if we are to see this continue to move to the downside. And we can see, looking at the previous all-time high we set all the way back here on Bitcoin in 2013, we could see if MSTR was to retrace continuously to that point in terms of its outperformance compared to Bitcoin, this would get us at somewhere around 100 shares per Bitcoin. So then if we see a Bitcoin price of say $150,000, just divide that by 100, we'd have a MicroStrategy price or strategy price of around $1,500. So doing this type of ratio analysis is really insightful and gives us some idea of not just what's likely to perform well versus US dollars, but which is likely to outperform other comparable assets. So that premium is really playing into the favor of MSTR, and that additional volatility can really provide outsized returns as MSTR and Bitcoin grow in unison. Now, of course, with this additional volatility, there's going to be additional volatility to the downside. Of course, at some point, we are going to see Bitcoin during a long, drawn-out bear cycle. As much as everyone likes to be bullish and think we're just going to see this long uptrend super cycle, boom and bust cycles are natural in any single market and asset class. We are likely going to see a big Bitcoin drawn out bear cycle in the coming years, and MSTR, of course, at some point is going to suffer because of that. And we are going to see likely this volatility result in even further downside for MSTR. But this is where we'll potentially see more accumulation from Saylor and Strategy. As this net asset value premium potentially dips beneath 1, it allows them potentially to conduct share buybacks, again with the ambition and anticipation of further Bitcoin accumulation. And one thing I'll definitely be doing is recently on Bitcoin Magazine Pro, we've actually added a number of alerts for MSTR. So if you just go to the alerts page here, once you have a site subscription, scroll all the way down. And what you can see is down here, we have the strategy dashboard alerts. So you can keep up to date with the price action, the premium net asset value, something we've discussed a lot in this video, and many other different key points. So this way you don't have to be checking the charts every single day. You don't have to be keeping up to date with every single change in the MSTR news or price action or shares or anything like that. You can just click on these alerts and you get an email anytime there's anything you really need to take a look at. But overall, I think MSTR still has a huge amount of upside potential remaining in this cycle. And I think that this potential inclusion in the S&P 500 really opens the floodgates for something we really haven't seen in a stock before. A company whose pretty much sole ambition at this point is just pure Bitcoin accumulation with this premium and now being included into the biggest index in the world, opening the doors to billions of dollars flowing into the index. It's really exciting, just anticipating and imagining what could happen in the coming months. Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to ensure you're receiving all of our content as soon as it's released. And make sure to check out all the charts we've discussed today, as well as the many more that are all available on BitcoinMagazinePro.com, your number 1 source for Bitcoin analysis. So just to summarize, Strategy has now in theory qualified for inclusion into the S&P 500 following recent positive BTC price action and FASB accounting changes. And while they may not be included immediately, they can now be considered and could be added as soon as before 2026. And while the initial weighting will be small, at probably around 0.2%, again, we can't know for certain, and it isn't purely based off market cap, there is some slightly more complex calculations needed to actually confirm that weighting. Either way, this opens the door for billions of necessary accumulation, because as soon as they're included in the S&P 500, all of the S&P 500 index holders are actually going to have to accumulate MSTR just to get this weighting back up to what it should be. And then the passive flows that we're going to see into the index, like we could see from the SPY, is billions and billions of dollars flowing into these index trackers, which is going to massively increase the amount of capital flowing into MSTR, which will then open the door for even more Bitcoin accumulation. We can see they already have around 600,000. Before the end of the year, they could be somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 Bitcoin. And looking at price action following other comparable stocks in Tesla and Coinbase, following their addition announcements, it's a realistic probability that we see a share price jump of around 100% in a fairly short space of time. So I think now is an incredibly exciting time to be a Strategy shareholder. And I think one of the best asymmetric bets currently available, not just in Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency markets, but in investing in general. If you liked this video, then please visit BitcoinMagazinePro.com, where our analytics help you to cut through the noise to make informed, data-driven decisions about Bitcoin. With over 150 live charts, personalized indicator alerts, in-depth crypto industry reports, API access, and more, all for a fraction of the standard industry price. And let me know what your thoughts are on MSTR or Strategy and Michael Saylor. Do you think that they're about to see their share price massively increase and potentially be included into the S&P 500 before 2026? Or do you think that maybe this current stock price is a little bit too volatile and it's going to take a little bit longer before they're actually included, and their share price is maybe not going to be as positively reflected, as maybe they're being diluted in terms of their Bitcoin treasury accumulation status by other Bitcoin treasury companies. Whatever your thoughts are, let me know in the comments below and on social media. I look forward to reading and replying to them. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.